So our next speaker is Dr. Darren Evans, who is a reader in ecology and conservation at Newcastle University, where he leads the network ecology group using DNA to analyse ecological networks. He's working with resilient food systems in South America and also a number of countries around the world, and is a member also of the Science Advisory Committee for another of those Christian conservation organisations that was mentioned in the previous talk, Arusha. So welcome, Darren, and thank you for speaking to us today.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I'm just pretending that I've got some notes here in front of me, but actually I haven't because it's all in my head. But it's always good to hold on to something in case you're nervous. So really what I want to do today is follow on some of the themes that we've already heard from John this morning. And what I want to do as well is just a bit of a personal insight or account of my life as a professional ecologist, conservation scientist working in a university sector, and how the science that I do and the motives for the science that I do as well are really sort of intricately linked with my Christian faith. And if nothing else today, the one thing that I hope at least is that you can see that there are people who are actively working in these fields who don't necessarily have all the answers, but are sort of, in all humility, trying our very best to find some solutions to some of the real world problems, motivated by our faith. And so, just to get started, one of the things I do every year as a lecturer at Newcastle University is that I get a new cohort of students, of tutees, who I'm responsible for the next 3 or 4 years. Many of them have chosen to do zoology, biology, specialising in ecology. And the first meeting that I have with them, I ask them, why should we care about conservation? And bearing in mind that many of these students have come to do a degree in this area because of they care. And so often what happens is people will put up a hand and say, well, it may be that we need to protect rainforests because there's a whole range of potential medicines that we can find to cure a whole range of human diseases and so on. For other people, they just think that there's a real injustice, that so many species are threatened with extinction, and they're really moved by the sort of documentaries of David Attenborough in particular. David Attenborough is a great recruiter for universities, I can tell you that. So we have those sorts of general discussions, and then I say, so why do you specifically, as individuals, care? And it's one of those moments where you can picture the tumbleweed sort of blowing through the office or the lecture theatre, because it may well be that they've never been asked, or it may well be that they can't actually articulate the reasons which are really sort of deep within them as to why they have chosen this particular route of study and hopefully a career in that area. And I find it really interesting because of the current motives for conservation, which I'm going to be talking about today, are very much about, the benefits that we as humans get from nature for ourselves. And it's this idea of ecosystem services. There's not one student that I've ever met that gets up first thing in the morning and says, I'm going to go and find what the ecosystem services of nature is for humans. That's not their motivation for choosing this particular degree or subject in the first place. It's something much deeper, something very, very much deeper within. And it's those sort of themes that I'm going to try and explore throughout my talk today. And so, in terms of the structure of my talk, I'm going to give you some statistics. I'm going to give you some recent findings on the state of the planet. It's going to be really depressing, okay? Like all the statistics we've heard so far, you're going to sit there thinking, oh, right. But then I'm going to move on to the main area of why our belief matters in global biodiversity conservation. Talk about people's beliefs and values more generally, and try to sort of make some connections in terms of our own lives and our own actions and the sort of decision making that we make within our own brains on a daily basis. And then I'm going to revisit what's called this Judeo-Christian stewardship environmental ethic. And so the point is, in this country at least, we've got a very long history of nature conservation. And it's sort of within the DNA of the British to really want to protect and care for nature, even though you may not see it with some current examples going on within our own countryside. But nevertheless, there is this long tradition which has kind of resulted in sort of global national park movements, for example. So I just want to go back to that towards the end, because it actually comes as a surprise to many of my students that actually Christians have got something to say about the environment, and not only that, it's actually shaped international policy. So my starting point is a report published by the United Nations called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So at the end of the last millennium, United Nations decided that they were going to commission a report to examine the state of the planet. So it was a good opportunity to take stock of what we're doing well, what we're doing less well, and ways in which we can improve. And so they published this report, but they basically framed it in a completely different way of thinking about nature that had gone before. And in particular, there was this focus on this term ecosystem services. What are ecosystem services? They are the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. And one of the reasons why they wanted to do this, and I've got a whole separate talk written on this if anybody's interested in the pros and cons, but the whole reason why they were wanting to do this was because it was generally accepted that nature was taken for granted by businesses, by governments, by you and I, that somehow the world was finite and that we could just continue to take resources to, to produce goods and so on. But what this wanted to do was to begin to spell out more specifically what those benefits were for people. And so the whole process set about trying to map these whole range of ecosystem services, which are called supporting, provisioning, that's food, fresh water, regulating, climate regulation, flood regulation, cultural, aesthetic, spiritual, educational, but mapping those services into what were regarded as the constituents of well-being of humans. And so you can begin to map out how these services affect our own personal security, our basic material for good life, our health, good social relations, and so on, with the end goal of having freedom of choice and action. So it's a very kind of admirable thing to want to do. And of course, you and I may kind of know this in our minds, that these things are important. But actually, what the people who wrote the report wanted to do was to map these out in the way that the decision makers, governments around the world, could then begin to understand. So bringing it, if you like, into the sort of language that policymakers want and need. And of course, there's a lot of stuff coming through, for those of you who follow the media, for example, on the importance of access to green space for people's mental health. The National Health Service has commissioned a lot of research in the United Kingdom, again showing that access to green open spaces is important for people's mental well-being, and there's a lot of work going on in terms of trying to overcome a lot of mental health issues by reconnecting people back with nature. And so the report also showed that there were a whole range of drivers that were impacting upon these ecosystem services, one of them obviously being population growth. The real challenge we face at the moment is we live in unprecedented times in that the global population is so large, but we're expecting another 2 billion people by 2050. And as a result of that, food demand is expected to more than double. So how are we going to feed these extra 2 billion people using less resources and with all the uncertainties that climate change are going to bring as well? And so the main finding really of the report was that they mapped out how the drivers of change, for example, habitat change, climate change, invasive species, overexploitation, pollution, impacted on a range of different biomes, ecosystems across the world. And effectively, the driver's impact on biodiversity is shown from the yellow to the red, with yellow being low and the red being very high. And then the arrows represent the current trends. And what you'll see is virtually all of them are increasing, or there's a very rapid increase as well. And so the general conclusion of the report is that most direct drivers of degradation in ecosystem services remain constant, or they're growing in their intensity in most ecosystems. So we've got problems because on the one hand, we can demonstrate how nature directly benefits us as humans, but on the other, the drivers of change are directly impacting on those ecosystem services, which will impact upon us. And so what it's tried to do is place a value on nature so that we might take things seriously for our own well-being. More recently, 6 or 7 weeks ago, again, those of you who follow the media would have seen sort of headlines where the Intergovernmental Platform on Science Policy, Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, again, a UN report, estimated that 1 million species are threatened with extinction. And I haven't actually finished reading all of the report, but what I have pulled out, again, are some sort of key headlines to at least emphasize the problems that we're facing as people on the planet. And again, this graph shows what were called the drivers of change, and the direct drivers here are land, sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, invasive alien species. And then there are also these indirect drivers, which interestingly are based on humans' values and behaviours, whether that's as individuals, whether that's corporately, whether that's as national governments and so on. So our values and our behaviours impact upon these drivers, which impact upon the way in which we live and manage the world, which then impacts on a whole range of other indicators. And so in this case, and apologies if you can't see it at the back, so according to the report, 47% of natural ecosystems have declined on average relative to their earliest estimated states. Approximately 1 in 4 species on the planet are already threatened with extinction. 1 in 4 species. The abundance of naturally present species has declined by nearly a quarter. The biomass and species abundance of wild mammals has fallen by 82%. And 72% of indicators developed by indigenous peoples and local communities show ongoing deterioration. So The point is that it's not looking good for biodiversity on our planet. Again, this is taken from the report, and these are the global extinction risks. Species which are regarded as threatened are in the orange to reds, not threatened are in the greens. Please bear in mind that not all biodiversity has an estimate because of so many of our plants, so many of our insects, animals generally, are very poorly studied. So we can't actually come up with any extinction estimates for many because we just don't know enough about them. There's still a huge amount of discovery to be done on our planet. But the point is you can sort of take home some statistics here in that 1 in 5 of our bird species threatened with extinction, about a third of our mammals, seed plants in particular are faring badly, over 30% of amphibians. So the point is many of our plants, animals, biodiversity on Earth is threatened with extinction. And it was from here that this 1 million estimate came. And of course, you know, so insects generally are a group of animals that I do a lot of work on. Again, very difficult to get estimates of population declines. But again, some of you would have seen some recent headlines in the press of a number of reports coming from around the world where they're showing this just complete collapse of invertebrates. And this isn't good science, but whenever I drive from the south of England to the north of England, I can remember as a child going on holiday to Yorkshire from Buckinghamshire, and the car being absolutely covered in squashed insects. I did a visit to my mother a few weeks ago, got back to Northumberland. There was hardly anything on the car, hardly anything. And we were just sort of talking about how historically we used to see an abundance of insects and moths and birds and things, but we don't see that anymore. And in fact, we were working in Scotland once, and one evening we were driving home, and it looked like it was snowing, and it was just full of moths. And we got out of the vehicle, and we just stood there, and were amazed by the abundance of all these things that had recently emerged. Now, I know that some people would hate that because not everybody likes moths, but we were just sort of standing there thinking, this is absolutely amazing. And I was talking with my wife just a few weeks ago, and we genuinely had the discussion, are we ever going to see that again? Will we ever see that in this country? And so the loss of the abundance of life on Earth is something that we should all be about. And so, of course, we had the quote this morning from David Attenborough, and there are a whole range of other sort of key environmental campaigners around the world who are basically saying, well, you know, things are really, really grim, actually. Sir Martin Rees, human beings only have a 50-50 chance of surviving the 21st century. James Lovelock, who termed the word ecosystem, before this century is over, billions of us will die, and the few breeding pairs of people that survive will be in the Arctic, where the climate remains tolerable. I mean, it's just utterly grim and depressing. And actually, there's almost a backlash by people towards these sorts of statistics. So the fact that I've just said, look, a United Nations report has said that 1 million species are at a threat of extinction, how does that make you feel? You know, does it almost feel it's so big, there's nothing I can do? Or I can't even imagine what 1 million species looks like. So there's a lot to be said in terms of whether this sort of presentation, data, outputs, people's views are actually what is necessary for making the sort of change that logically we know we're going to have to do in order to make the world a better place. And so I come back to this whole question of people's values and belief and how that does or does not impact upon the way in which we view the world and our place within it. So again, the IPBES report, again, framed the value of nature very much on this concept of natural capital. So in the West, at least, there's been a huge amount of effort in the past few years to try and place a value on nature. And the reason why they're doing this is because of the people who make the decisions seem to be the accountants. They seem to be the bean counters. And unless you can put things in an economic framework, they're not going to understand it. And that's probably why nature hasn't been taken into accounting policies and decision making for such a long time. And so for those of you who like coffee, I do, perhaps a little bit too much. I'm sorry to say that coffee crops are under attack by a particular pest. And there's all sorts of predictions about lack of coffee in the future. Well, you know, that's certainly for an academic is really bad news. But again, what you can do is you can exclude birds from your crop, and then you can look at what the rate of damage by this particular pest is compared to an area where you haven't excluded birds using netting and so on. And actually, some people did some experiment, some American scientists, and they actually valued that this particular bird was worth $310 per hectare because it was a natural form of pest control. And without this bird, farmers would have to use insecticides and various other things to manage their crops. And here in the United Kingdom, we had our own ecosystem assessment as a follow-on from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where we valued pollinators to be worth around about £500 million to the UK economy. And whatever you think about the ecosystem service approach, one of the things that I've noticed is that the general public get the importance of pollinators and maintaining pollinators. And I think that has been driven through this ecosystem service approach. However, this has really divided the academic community. So the conservation scientists working in ecosystem services, you either love it or you hate it. And the UK environmental campaigner and journalist George Monbiot is particularly vocal in attacking this ecosystem service approach. But I think he really gets to the point, and I think what he says will probably resonate with several of us in the room. And he says, rarely will the money be made by protecting nature match the money to be made by destroying it. Nature offers low rates of return by comparison to other investments. And I think this is the key bit. If we allow the discussion to shift from values to value, from love to greed, we cede the natural world to the forces wrecking it. He's very good at taking particular positions on things. But I think it is very true that the current paradigm in conservation science is valuing nature for its economic benefit to humans. And we know by any sort of logical conclusion that that's going to have implications because of what do we do with biodiversity that has no direct impact upon us? Do we just allow that to become extinct? And that is actually the decisions that we are going to have to make in our lifetime. Where are we going to focus any of our conservation effort? And is it purely going to be on the biodiversity that directly impacts upon us? And what's the biblical basis for that as well? But of course, I'm talking about a very Western way of looking and valuing nature, where very often talking about our beliefs and values are off limits. But I have the privilege of working in Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina, Tanzania, and other parts of the world, where actually talking about people's belief isn't off limits. It's just natural. It's really obvious when you're in North Sulawesi, whether you're talking to a Christian or a Muslim. And people are very open about their faith and their belief. Whereas I think here, particularly in the UK, across Europe, probably North America, I don't know, but it tends to be that these things are off limits. But we know that our belief affects our actions. And so again, here's a fantastic sign from India. In the next incarnation, you might be an endangered species. Help us save the Siberian crane. Do not trouble the bird. Do not try to get close. Watch from a distance. Respect the bird. But the sign was put up to help people think about their actions and where that fits into their belief systems. And so the point that I make with my students, again, when I teach conservation biology, is that our beliefs shape the environment. They shape the land in which we live. So this may be a very sort of beautiful landscape to look at, but it's driven by people's religious belief system. Throughout the world, you often find these sort of high peaks as kind of spiritual places for people. And presumably in Saltend, in Hull, on the Humber, presumably because of you and I enjoy having cars, mobile phones, all the benefits that come with technology, perhaps we don't mind having an oil refinery pumping out CO2 and causing a blot on the landscape generally. Perhaps we feel that that's a price worth paying, but the point is, this has all come from our belief system. And so the point is, again, as I say to my students, and again, I really upset people sometimes. So there was a course that I was teaching at the University of Hull where they taught the fundamentals of conservation biology, where to plant things, how to reintroduce things, and so on. And I would always go in, I had one lecture, and I would always go in and say, everything that you've taught so far is completely meaningless. And they look at each other, yeah, that's what we thought. But no, they were sort of taken aback by this. And I said, if you want to be a conservation scientist, then you can't just be parachuted in to a remote island in Indonesia and expect to do the conservation biology unless you understand the social economic system, people's politics, their religion, their belief. You've got to get to understand those people. And often, those things aren't taught within our textbooks. So here's an example of the incentive for biodiversity conservation taken from this textbook here, that we do it because it benefits ourselves or strengthens the relationship of humans, opportunity for the study of ecosystems. This is incomplete. So I don't show this book to my students because there are other really good conservation biology textbooks out there that talk about people's belief systems and why that's important. And I'll come to that in a moment. But it shouldn't come as any surprise to us that as we face an environmental crisis, there are a range of organisations around the world where people of religious persuasion are trying to do something about the crisis that they see. One of which is a Rocha that we've already come across, and I'll finish my talk by some correspondence I had with Peter Harris, who's the co-founder of a Rocha. But the point is, people are already being motivated, that although perhaps the Christian church in the West has come quite slow to the show for a whole range of reasons, we shouldn't be surprised that there are other religions actively involved in this at the moment, because they know that their belief matters and they're trying to square the crisis that they face with their own belief and value system. And so again, in Indonesia a few years ago, this was a newspaper cutting that I took where the WWF hailed Indonesian fatwa against illegal hunting and poaching of animals. The fatwa by the Indonesian Ulema Council declares such activities unethical, immoral, and sinful. I mean, this is huge. This is huge. When you have religious organisations, churches, whatever, standing up and saying, this is wrong. And actually, we don't see this in this country. And perhaps for some of you here, perhaps you should stand up and perhaps you should say what the Christian perspective is. Bring that conversation to the table. Remember the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, right at the very beginning, it spoke about cultural services, where they recognised that the services that nature provides in terms of our recreation, aesthetic and spiritual. And whereas other countries around the world have really taken on board this sort of spiritual aspect of the importance of the natural world, here in the UK we've just tended to focus on the economics. But it's just not enough, because it doesn't satisfy some of the very deepest reasons why myself and my students and many other people went into conservation in the first place. And so in that general discussion I've had with Peter Harris from Russia, this is on the PlanetWise blog, by the way, so you can go to the Russia website and get hold of this. I'm sorry it's a block of text. I know that's kind of really a bit sort of depressing before lunchtime. But it's a really important point, at least, in terms of the point that I'm trying to say today. And it was this all around this idea of, is it off limits to talk about our belief to policymakers, to scientists, to decision makers responsible for the management of creation? And he says there is certainly a troubling disconnect between the secular West and the global South, where biodiversity is concentrated. It's potentially problematic because where conservation funds are raised and decisions are made in the West, beliefs are regarded as personal, and so they remain unexpressed. Whereas in the South, where there is a more seamless and easily expressed conversation between action and its faith motivations, important motivations for conservation can go by unregarded, by conservation professionals arriving from another world. And again, this is this idea that we cannot send Western-trained scientists from our universities and parachute them in to remote parts of the world unless they fully understand and appreciate and love the people who are there and what drives and motivates them in the first place. But Peter then sort of concludes by saying, I do believe there are encouraging signs, and paradoxically, it's the realization that conservation itself is inevitably a religious exercise, even for secular people, that is moving this forward. And, you know, at that moment, if I ever said this at a scientific conference, people would be in outrage. But what he says is, I mean by this religious with a very small r, but in the sense that it is an expression of convictions that are not exclusively empirically derived, at least. It's an expression of convictions that are not exclusively empirically derived. And it is the profound struggle to establish this value for nature, which I've been talking about, which he thinks is driving it. And I think it's really true. And in fact, we did run a conference with the British Ornithologists Union a few years ago. And the title of the conference is Ecosystem Services, Do We Need Birds? Do we need birds? Do they provide any direct benefits to us? And actually, Peter Harris, he came and he gave a talk. He was really worried about it. But he was somebody coming at the science-religion interface with all the kind of fears that might have and feeling inadequate and so on, but just sort of saying what Russia was doing around the world, the difficulties that they had, but that they were driven profoundly by their Christian faith. And at the end, it was really interesting because loads of people came and spoke to him, and they would start by saying, I'm not a Christian, but I really liked what you said. Or somebody else said, I'm an atheist, but I'm really surprised, actually, that your Bible says anything about the environment. And then you kind of think, wow, people really don't have much of a framework anymore about the biblical basis for many things. And we were talking just at the break about actually all we need to do is read the Bible to people. And often people are amazed that actually there's some really fantastic guidance and ethics for us more generally. But what I do with my students is I remind them that there is a Judeo-Christian stewardship environmental ethic. So I've just pulled this out of the conservation biology science textbooks that I use with my students. And the dominant worldview really is based on a biblical understanding of stewardship. And it has actually influenced some international treaties, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And it's this whole idea on the intrinsic value of species. It speaks without equivocation. So the whole idea actually is that the world doesn't exist primarily for people. The world exists primarily for God. And actually all that is within it is valued, loved, and God has plans for. And again, we've already had a biblical basis this morning, but again, I've just pulled this out of the textbook that I use with my students. And these are some of the things, again, where we say non-human creatures are appropriate subjects of human care. It says so in Genesis 2. Legal protection is applied to the land as an entity in itself, not as a commodity or as a means of producing a livelihood. Non-human creation is included in God's stated plans for the redemption of the world to himself. And it's at moments like that people are just baffled, that, crikey, right, okay, so actually Scripture has lots of things that resonates with me in a way that I haven't been able to articulate before, but actually it's formed the basis of some of our paradigms that we've used in global nature conservation more generally. So I think perhaps what we also need to do is revisit the Christians that were involved in the early movements of nature conservation, in the same way that we should revisit what our universities are for and the foundations in which they are built, why we have universal healthcare within our country, and who drove that. I lived in Hull for 7 years, where Wilberforce was an MP. Wilberforce was an evangelical Christian who was famous for bringing an end to slavery. There are presidents, there are people who have really shaped the world in which we live. And what I would like to see is people reawakening to that and really getting engaged with a whole range of issues around the world which have been articulated by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Many of my friends who are people of faith are involved heavily in so many of these things. No poverty, zero hunger, life on land, climate action. These are the sort of things that resonate with us and we should get fully behind in supporting, I think, as churches. And finally, this is just a quote from Simon Stewart, who's a Christian who was the former head of the IUCN Species Survival Commission. Again, people actively bringing their faith into the workplace. And this is his reflection of his role, where he's seeing these extinction statistics on a daily basis and sort of feeling, where is the hope? And he says that Christians are committed by their biblical beliefs not only to the conviction that God himself cares for his universe in a daily and ongoing way, but also that he helps and guides people in their conservation efforts. We are therefore not on our own against the relentless forces of unsustainable development and rapacious materialism. Every time we celebrate a conservation success story, such as the recovery of the white rhinoceros in southern Africa, We are strengthened in this present hope that God is working with us to redeem his creation. Thank you very much.
There are lots of questions following that. So, any questions? Can I ask a question just while people are having a think? What do you think it would look like for the Christian church in this country to act in a way that's effective? Some of the ways in it.
From a conservation perspective or generally? So, I mean, there are already some really great initiatives going on within UK churches, and that is driven by Arosha UK, and in particular this project called Eco Congregations, which I know some of you have been part of. And the whole idea there is to sort of produce a movement amongst Christians where they really sort of begin to take grasp of their biblical responsibility for the natural world. And there's lots of examples of churches, you know, particularly old Anglican churches. They've got some of the best biodiversity because they've got fantastic graveyards where nobody's ever put any insecticides down and so on. There's lots of things that you can do locally around church buildings and so on. And I think the real benefit of doing things within a church is that it is quite a rare way these days, I think, for people to do things jointly in community. So again, I've been in churches in inner cities in the UK for a long time, and one of the things we would often do is take people out into the local river where we would pull out trolleys and, you know, just sort of have a demonstration that somehow we want to try and care for this green space because we know it's important to the local community. We know it's important for local wildlife. So we're just going to do our very best to try and look after it in a very sort of simple way. And it tends to be really fun because people fall into the river or you pull out some, well, I'm not going to even say what sort of things you pull out of rivers because it's too rude. But nevertheless, you know, there's a lot of fun to being part of that. And I think it just, bearing in mind that so many people are disconnected to nature generally, more people now live in cities than in the countryside, that there is just a way of getting out and being able to study the world. I mean, even this garden here is, I mean, this is such a fantastic place to have this this course because we can sit out in the grass. There's all sorts of hoverflies out there. I was watching a song thrush beating a snail to death so that it could eat it just down there. There's a wonderful sort of wildflower meadow over there as well with all sorts of interesting insects. It's just lovely, isn't it, to be out there and to enjoy that. And I know it's a rare thing in the UK as well. So I think what we just need to do is get people out, studying, enjoying, and doing something as a community that has a benefit to everybody, including nature.
Great. And maybe you can do a nature walk through the gardens after that.
Yeah, okay, right.
Anyone wants to see the small groups?
Thank you very much. The previous talker, John, spoke of bodies of people, especially in America, who said we're done for, and the sooner the apocalypse happens, the better. What would you say to those? I know what I would say, but what would you say?
So, yeah, thank you. It's a good question. I became a Christian at university. I've come from a background where I grew up on a housing association estate. My interest in nature stemmed from watching sparrows nesting in a crack in the wall above my bedroom window, and feeding pigeons and just simple things like that. I still love pigeons, by the way, even though I know lots of people don't. When I went to university, and became a Christian, I was actually really surprised by the sort of reactions I would get when I spoke to people about the fact that I was doing an environmental science degree. And the first encounter I can remember was with somebody in my halls of residence who lived opposite me, and he came across and he said, "I'm a Christian, but I don't think we should care about the environment because it's all going to be burnt up anyway." And I remember sort of thinking, that's a bit odd. That's a bit strange. Where does it say that? So, obviously with time, I started to read scripture and get to understand it a bit more. But then I also went to a local church, and I remember some people there really trying to talk me out of doing environmental science as a degree because they regarded the New Age movement in the 1990s was quite visible, and there was this real sense that somehow I would just be pulled away from my faith, and actually we should have nothing to do with them. And I remember sort of saying at the time, how big is your God? Seriously, how big is your God? I mean, I just had this life-changing experience, and I couldn't square what they were saying. And actually, I was thinking more, well, I can see this environmental crisis. I mean, it's nothing new. We've had it for decades. We just haven't been acting on it. And I remember thinking and saying to them, why isn't the church doing anything about this? Why aren't you taking this seriously? You've just been singing in church that day about your creator God and the wonder of creation. And it's just illogical to assume that somehow, on the one hand, we have been given some responsibility for the planet, which God regards as good and wonderful in all its complexity, on the one hand, and feel that somehow we can trash it. It just makes no sense to me whatsoever. And although perhaps we don't hear it so much here in the UK within our churches, I do come across it actually quite a lot. And so, again, we were talking at the break that perhaps really what we need to do is just remind people of what Scripture actually says. And I think, on the one hand, we know that there's been criticism of Christianity in terms of its interpretation of dominion in Genesis. But more recently, and the quote that I had from Simon Stewart was a reply to somebody called David Orr, who basically put the root of our ecological crisis, again, on Christians, but for their eschatological view that actually all things are going to be burnt up. And that quote that I had was actually a reply in a scientific journal where we said, although we acknowledge that in some fringes of the church there are people that do hold those views that you articulated, there's no biblical basis for it, and it's certainly not the motivation for a whole range of professional scientists who are out. And I do think actually our end-time theology, I do think it is important, and I do think we do need to revisit it, because we were again talking about the rise of kind of kingdom theology within churches more generally. And one of the things that myself and my wife try to do is live prophetically. And what does that mean? It means ushering in the kingdom. What do we mean by ushering in of the kingdom? That means an understanding of eschatology. So I do think that actually we do need to sort of take grasp again of what Scripture does say, because that is ultimately one of the motivators too. And I do get pushback from that. So again, I was talking with John earlier, and the pastor of my church, so I go to a vineyard church, he's responsible for the churches in the north of England. He did his PhD at Newcastle in biology, in my department, with one of my colleagues. on ozone, and so is perfectly placed to understand and advocate the Christian response to climate change. And he acknowledges that himself, and I'm constantly nudging him and saying, okay, now's your chance. Haven't heard you talk about the environment in your last sermon, and yet there's 1 million children out on the streets. Let's make it contemporary. Let's link things up. So, and it sounds weird because I hear myself saying the same thing that I've been saying for maybe 10 or 20 years, that the message hasn't changed. I just think and hope, actually, that if we are going to take this seriously, we take our faith seriously.
Thank you very much. Going back to the comments you were making on the problem of nature being considered because of the value it has for humans as against the intrinsic value of nature itself. There are aspects of nature that are quite harmful to human beings, and particularly in the nature of disease and virology and so on. Do you accept that nature has to be taken holistically? In other words, there is no part of nature that actually is designed to be damaging to nature as a whole and even to humans as a whole. How do we handle that balance of addressing the supposedly harmful aspects of nature with, certainly from a Christian point of view, having a holistic view of nature?
So I think as a scientist we need a better understanding of biology, and I think within theology we need a better understanding of biology. So one of the things I do in terms of my research is try to build what we call ecological networks, so species interaction networks, where we're trying to better understand the interconnectedness of all life, because we still don't know what the fundamental assembly rules are for life on Earth that gives us these sort of persistent functioning ecosystems that we see. We know a lot about biodiversity. We still know very little about how it interacts. And we know very little about the co-evolution of life on Earth as well. And so in that sense, it's very often, you hear people talking about viruses as being bad. We know about good bacteria and bad bacteria because of Yakult and various things on the TV. But the point is, even as individuals, we carry a huge number of bacterial viruses and various other things, which actually have helped to shape life on Earth as well. And it's just that, like insects, a few of them may become invasive or may become problematic in terms of producing food, for example. So personally, I think we need to have a better understanding of humans' position in the global food web, and a theological re-examination of that as well. And just at this point in time, perhaps a little bit of humility in terms of our lack of understanding of life on Earth and how it came about and what sustains it and how it's sustainable, whilst also accepting the fact that some biodiversity can become harmful to us as human beings too, for which, it's right that we do everything we can to try and maintain our health. So the thing that often I struggle with when I'm listening to talks about the nature of life on Earth from the biblical perspective is that it doesn't include a huge amount of biology. And that's quite difficult for me and most other people in this country who have had a school education which has been science focused. And that's why these sorts of initiatives we need to see more of, much more of, so that we can begin to think about how theology impacts upon our science and vice versa. But at the moment, I would say, from my understanding of life on Earth, it's still in its infancy.
Just to go back to the kind of question of what's going to happen in the end and how that might influence our desire to care, do you think that there's kind of a flip side if we're thinking about, well, ultimately God is going to make all things new? Do you think there's a potential for us to use that to motivate people and free them up from paralysis and fear and things? Have you ever thought about that?
It should be a motivation, but also it implies that we do nothing. It implies that we sit back. I know that's not what you're saying, but I think that is prevalent in that. So some of our friends are church leaders in Salford, and they've published a book recently. He's called Chris Lane, and it's called Ordinary Miracles. And one of the profound things in that was that they were saying that they were within a church, in a middle-class church in Manchester, on top of a hill, looking down upon Langworthy, one of the most deprived parts of the country, and praying for God's kingdom to come, and for God to come, and for God to change that place. And then they realised that in order to do that, they were part of God's plan, and they had to go and do it. And so they did, and hugely sacrificial and hugely costly. And they say in the book that if you looked at the church that they've got now, it's unrecognisable in that it's not the sort of church that you would expect to walk into on a Sunday, because most of their activities don't happen on a Sunday, and actually most of the people who attend the church aren't Christians. But they're there for the long haul. And it's very much this sort of incarnational thinking of that God uses us in a priestly way to establish his will and his kingdom. And so in that sense, wouldn't it be great if we just prayed that God would just sort it all out? But actually there's precedents in scripture where people haven't done what God said, and they face the consequences of doing that. And I do fear that is potentially our lot if we don't do something about it now, if we don't move now. Then, well, we're already seeing people being affected. So I think it's part of the mystery of Christian faith, at least, that we go about fulfilling God's will as people. And I think that's what we need to do in this crisis that we're facing. I think we just have to be obedient, and we have to make those big sacrifices. And for many people that isn't very appealing, actually. It's because it's costly and it's sacrificial. But it is real.
Yeah, so can we use hope as a motivator? Because I think sometimes when we're looking at all of these massive issues and some of the scary statistics, like people feel paralyzed and hopeless. So where is the hope coming from for us?
I think absolutely it's the one thing that we have that we can uniquely offer to a community where things are grim, you know. And as you can see, I'm trying to sort of keep it in myself. So I cry over this.
So Darren, my question touches on your talk and the previous one as well. You've started talking about kingdom theology. Previously, we've heard a lot of talk about duty of care as a Christian responsibility. Do you see them as different?
Yeah.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to say yes. Okay.
No, not in any way. Not if we're going to take Scripture seriously. So we have to take on board that the earth has been entrusted to our care, and that there is a duty, and actually we fail and we're sinful, and there's a consequence of that, not necessarily for us but on other people too. You can sort of see the visible manifestation of sin. So it is really important that we do our duty. And that does, as we all know, and it's really uncomfortable, require an inward looking of what we are doing as individuals, as a community, as a nation, and so on. And it's really hard because I can be accused of being hypocritical. And there are lots of things that I struggle with in terms of my own way of life, and lots of tensions, and how do I do the right thing here? How do I change? And something's completely beyond my control because I'm locked into this economic system that's been embraced by our country as well. And it's not easy, but I think that there is wisdom, and I think the wisdom is there in Scripture, and I think it is like a gold mine, and I think if we take hold of that and really begin to take it seriously, then I think we can change a generation. And like I said, the young people who I interact with, they're always amazed and they're always surprised of the Christian message.
Any last questions before we go? Oh yes, it's a hand behind you, and then it comes to
Thanks, Professor. Your lecture is very, very interesting. My question is about ecology in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Russia is big country, it's very, very big country, and damage of nature in our country related with big trouble for all our world. And do you know, Professor, about our ecological organization in Russia? And if yes, how they cooperated with ecological organization in the world? Thanks.
So no, I don't. I'm afraid I don't know much about Russia. I know it's a hugely important country in terms of agricultural production and natural resources. I think wherever you'll know, of course, far better than I, but wherever I travel to, I find that there are different levels of interest in ecology on the political scales of different nations. So on the one hand, within Europe, we can see a big focus on climate change at the moment. But you could go to other countries like Indonesia, where it's not the top priority, actually. It's probably bringing people out of poverty is their top priority. And yet at the same time, you can go to their mangrove ecosystems, which is one of the systems that I'm studying, and you can already see the dieback of the trees as a result of climate change. And we know through the recent tsunamis and so on that maintaining these mangrove ecosystems are really important for protecting people. They're nurseries for fish, for example, where local fishing communities are hugely dependent. And so I think that the real challenge is to work internationally, I think. And I think churches have got a real part to play here in that the Christian Church is the largest NGO in the world. And so when you see things like the Pope's encyclical, I know people who aren't Christian who will even say, this is big, this is important, and we should be listening to this. And I would hope that actually by working together, and the one thing that Christians should be able to show at least is this idea of unity and sharing and doing things for the common good, that there are opportunities to begin to make this a global issue that all countries take seriously. So again, I know that's not a specific answer for Russia, but all I would do is just encourage you in any way that you can, in any capacity, to be an advocate and to try and bring about change, and to become networked through organisations such as this, and to find some joint resources somehow. But it's an enormous task.
Okay, I was going to opt that, but I was going to add to what you'd said earlier, that I think my understanding of being kingdom people is being involved in God's redemptive work in creation. That's part of our care now, is to redeem what, and so being part of Christ's mission is to be part of that redemptive mission, and to recognize that the Bible talks a lot about making all things new. But of course the word is not neos, meaning new like a new car, but kainos, which means to renew.
Yeah.
And so I believe that our role in redemption is part of God's renewing of creation, and our caring for creation, our re-establishing of species, is part of that renewal.
Yeah.
And I think it's just get that perspective, and that's, I think, again, is where our hope is.
We'll finish there. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.